So this session for the Waymark Ministries Zoom room is entitled The Role of Mysticism in Meditation. And I want to look at some different concepts of both meditation, but also looking at what mysticism is. So if we're going to look at the role of mysticism in meditation, we first need to establish what each of those things is. What is mysticism? What is meditation? What role does mysticism play in Christian meditation, particularly, as that's the focus which I will be coming from, the perspective I will be coming from. And what's the difference in practice? How does the practice of meditation differ with a mystical element included? So to begin with, I want to look at what mysticism is. It's possibly one of the most misunderstood phrases or terms or words, particularly by Western Christians. You find Eastern Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, slip very easily into mysticism because the mystery and mysticism has always been a central part of their theology and understanding. Whereas in the Western Church, in the Latin Church, it's always been a little bit on the fringes, on the edges, mysticism. And particularly in the Protestant stream, the conservative end of the Protestant stream, mysticism is seen sometimes and somewhat with a bit of a dubious eye. I'm not quite sure it even fits in Christianity at all. And the difficulty is that there's a phrase that I picked up in one or two books that I'll kind of consolidate 2 or 3 different illustrations, that mystics are a bit like snowflakes, not the snowflakes that the politicians talk about and things, but actually that everyone is different. So every mystic is different. So every answer you'll get for what is mysticism will be different. And in fact, one of the books I'm going to quote from in a moment comes from William McNamara. In fact, I'll start with that one. William McNamara, one of my favorites, more modern mystics, died in the early 2000s. He was a discalced Carmelite monk from Nova Scotia. So that's some serious commitment, that is, to be discalced in Nova Scotia. Discalced means you don't wear shoes. Nova Scotia, of course, being a very cold and snowy place. So William McNamara, in his book, Earthy Mysticism, begins the introduction, one of the best beginnings of an introduction I have ever come across. He says, the first sentence in the introduction, the mystic is not a special kind of person, but every person is a special kind of mystic. The mystic is not a special kind of person, but every person is a special kind of mystic. And I'm going to read a little bit more from that in a moment. So the mystic is, or the mysticism is within each of us. So every single person has the concept, the ability, and probably the desire, if we actually stop and think about it long enough, to be a mystic. And as we unpack the concept of what mysticism is, we will see that as we go through. One of the best books ever written on mysticism is this one here by Evelyn Underhill, simply called Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness. So Evelyn Underhill, early 20th century writer, arguably, in my opinion, has never really been, or this book has never really been superseded in looking at what mysticism is. And so I just want to read a few paragraphs of her introduction to perhaps what mysticism is. So she says this. This is in the middle of a chapter, so lots of other things have already been said. True mysticism is active and practical, not passive and theoretical. It is an organic life process, something which the whole self does, not something as to which its intellect holds an opinion. Its aims are holy, transcendental, and spiritual. It is in no way concerned with adding to, exploring, or rearranging or improving anything in the visible universe. The mystic, as such, brushes aside that universe, even in its supernormal manifestations, though they do not, in their enemies, as their enemies declare, neglect their duty to the many. For the mystic's heart is always set upon the changeless one. This one, for the mystic, not merely the reality of all that is, but also the living and personal object of love, never an object of exploration. It draws their whole being homeward, but always under the guidance of the heart. Living union with this one, which is the term of his adventure, is a definite state or form of enhanced life. It is obtained neither from an intellectual realization of its delights, nor from the most acute emotional longings. Though these must be present, they are not enough. It is arrived at by an arduous psychological and spiritual process, the so-called mystic way, entailing the complete remaking of character and the liberation of a new, or rather latent, form of consciousness, which imposes on the self the condition which is sometimes inaccurately called ecstasy, but is better named the unitive state. Mysticism, then, is not an opinion. It is not a philosophy. It has nothing in common with the pursuit of occult or secret knowledge. On the one hand, it is not merely the power of contemplating eternity. On the other, it is not to be identified with any kind of religious queerness and strangeness. It is the name of that organic process which involves the perfect consummation of the love of God. The achievement here and now of the immortal heritage, or, if you like it better, for this means exactly the same thing, mysticism is the art of establishing one's conscious relation with the absolute. And that absolute is a capital A, as was the reality and the living union with the one, all capitalized. This is all about the divine presence. The art of establishing one's conscious relation with the absolute, with that divine reality. So Underhill here just expands on the idea that actually mysticism is not theoretical. It is practical, or a term that's more commonly used, experiential. It is something that is experienced between you and God. It's not a theory, although her book is very excellent, and I've done lots of study on mysticism. I did some of my master's degree essays on the mystics and their ideas. And I've got a book just coming out in June that's all about teachings from the mystics, the art of peace, it's called. Life lessons from Christian mystics. And reading is great, but actually the experience, the practical application is what is important. I want to read a short piece from, now I've got to find the right bit now. I closed the book, I didn't mark it properly. Here we go. From this other book, this is an excellent introduction to mysticism. This is by a writer called Carl McColman. It's called The Big Book of Christian Mysticism, The Essential Guide to Contemplative Spirituality. And arguably, I would say personally, this is the best introduction book. Underhill's book is a little bit more dense than this one. So if you want an introduction book, then Carl McColman's Big Book of Christian Mysticism is an excellent first step into it. So he says this: Christian mysticism is not the same as ordinary religious belief or observance. It has room for profound doubt and insistent questioning. It doesn't ask you to check your mind in at the door and submit your will to some sort of external authority, whether that be a local church, a priest or a minister or a book. Rather, Christian mysticism argues that Any respect you pay to external authority can emerge only from a profound inner experience or conviction that God is real and present, and that it is both possible and plausible for the average person to have a truly experiential relationship with God. Christian mysticism invites us to look at God, Christ, the church, our own souls, and our understanding of such things as sin and holiness in new ways. Mysticism doesn't contradict traditional religious teaching in many ways, however. It represents an element of Christianity that transcends human logic or reason. It can therefore appear on the surface to be subversive of mundane piety. Well, it is subversive, and it has the potential to undermine everything, especially all of our cherished beliefs, sacred cows, and dogmatic illusions. It undermines all of our settled ways of looking at things, not because it seeks to cause chaos, but rather because it helps us open our hearts and minds to something that cannot be captured in ideology, dogma, or theology, or philosophy. And that something is God. So what McColman says here is that Christian mysticism is something that cannot, as the others say, be captured in ideology, dogma, theology, or philosophy. It is something more. It is something experiential. And it causes us to challenge those things which we think we know. It causes us to wonder whether there is something more. Let's get back to William McNamara's book here. After he's told us that everybody is a special kind of mystic, he says the mystic is one who consciously and thoroughly immerses himself in the mystery of life and enjoys communion with the ultimate being. Again, capitalized. Everyone is partially immersed in the mystery, and to some small degree enjoys communion with ultimate being. But the mystic knows God by experience, not by periodic or dramatic peak experiences, but by the unremarkable quotidian experience of a lifetime. Little by little, quite imperceptibly, the Spirit of God seeps in and takes possession of the mystic. So the pattern you see in all three of these books, and actually what you see in pretty much every teacher of mysticism and mystic in Christian history, is that mysticism is not about ecstatic spiritual experiences. Actually, mysticism is much more about the reality of life in which we live, connected deeply and experientially with the divine presence. And it is the practice of meditation, which we'll get onto in a moment, that enables us to become more mystical in our understandings. Another quote from later on in the big book of Christian mysticism. McColman says, in the pages to come, which he's going to look into, I talk less and less about mysticism and more about contemplation and the contemplative life. This is simply an acknowledgement that contemplation, also known in Christian terms as contemplative prayer, is the heart of the spiritual practices by which we open ourselves to the mystery of Christ. To truly embrace the possibility of moving deeper and deeper into the adventure of Christian mysticism, it requires a spiritual practice and discipline. And of all the spiritual exercises associated with mysticism, contemplation is the summit. I want to mention that those serious about Christian mysticism, not as a hobby or a fad, but as a sustainable, transformational way of life, will find in contemplation, or the contemplative life, the heart of their exploration. So this leads into the question of what is meditation and how does mysticism play a role in Christian meditation? And what I want to do is look at the role of meditation, what it is, and how that relates to the contemplative life or contemplative practices or contemplative prayer, which is a fairly Christian, standardized Christian term. So meditation is the physical practices that create the environment in which we can gain a sense of the mystical or gain a sense of the divine. Now, of course, meditation can be practiced by people without a spiritual context. In that sense, meditation is really simply an idea or practices of stilling ourselves, being centered within ourselves, calming our thoughts, calming our emotions, becoming fully present in the moment. And those are great aims and goals. And there's a good deal of research around, and I do teaching on it specifically, on just the physical benefits of meditation, the way that your brain changes. If you practice meditation, it becomes more calm, you become less able to be influenced by depression and anxiety and those sorts of things. And that obviously affects your physical being, because we all know that our emotional well-being affects our physical being. On a small scale, we know that if we get stressed, which is an emotional state, we can get a headache. And if you spend a lot of time over a long period stressed, that can cause things like stomach ulcers and IBS and things like that. So our physical self responds to our emotional well-being. So the practice of meditation as a physical or as a non-spiritual practice has enormous benefits, because it does change and transform our emotional well-being to something more calm and more positive, which has an effect on our physical well-being. But for us as a spiritual being, or people with a spiritual context to life, meditation enables us to better and more deeply connect to that spiritual center in ourselves. What the practice and the disciplines of the meditation practice does for us is it creates an inner environment. It creates the space within ourselves to be hospitable to God, if you want a better term than that. To basically to offer the space within ourselves for God to turn up, to engage with us, so we can become more aware of that divine presence. So the practical practice of meditation enables that space within our minds, within our inner beings, our hearts, to engage with God. Put simply, if you want to put it in a physical representation, if I want to listen to you and you've got something to say, then I'm going to have to stop talking. At the moment, you are creating the space for me to enter into your being. For my thoughts and my words to enter into your being, you're creating that space by sitting still and being quiet. And if I want to create that space for you, or if you have something to say, then I have to sit still and be quiet, that I can hear you. That's the practice of meditation. From a Christian perspective, that's the practice of meditation. That's what our contemplative practice. There's a huge overlap between contemplation and meditation. There is a slight difference in them. And what I want to show in this differentiation is that I would term meditation as the practice, and I would term the contemplative life as the ontological outcome of that. So the ontology is who we are. It's about the sense of being. It's not about what we do. It's about who we are. So contemplation, I think, is more to do with our ontology. Meditation is more to do with the practice. And it's the practice that draws us into who we are. It creates us as a being in the work of God. God works within us, the Bible tells us. God continues to work in us over time, and gradually we become more and more like God. That's what Scripture tells us. 2 Corinthians 3:18 tells us that as the Spirit works in us, we become better reflections of God's glory. That's what 2 Corinthians 3:18 says. And we are transformed, Romans 12, verse 2, we are transformed by a renewing of our mind. God works within us. But what the practice of meditation does is allows God to work in us. And there's a number of things that come up through the practice of meditation, but most significantly is the sense of stillness, the sense of quiet, the sense of being in the place, the sense of creating that space within our minds and our inner beings to welcome the work of that divine presence. But within that, we have that mystical element. So let me just read that paragraph from the Big Book of Christian Mysticism again about contemplation. So he says, in the pages to come, I talk less and less about mysticism and more about contemplation and the contemplative life. This is simply an acknowledgement that contemplation is the heart of the spiritual practices by which we open ourselves to the mystery of Christ. To truly embrace the possibility of moving deeper and deeper into the adventure of Christian mysticism requires spiritual practice and discipline. And of all the spiritual exercises associated with mysticism, contemplation is the summit. I want to mention that those serious about Christian mysticism, not as a hobby or a fad, but as a sustainable, transformational way of life, will find in contemplation or the contemplative life the heart of their exploration. So mysticism in itself is the deeper continual awareness of the divine presence. Mysticism is an experiential aspect of our faith. It is experiencing the divine presence. The divine is always present. I do my best never to use phrases such as "let's invite God to be part of this." I come into God's presence now. Yeah, that sort of thing, because God is always present. The divine is always present, like the air. Most of the time, we're not aware of that presence, but sometimes we become deliberately, consciously aware of that presence. So the air, for example, is always present around us as we wander around the surface of the planet. Most of the time, we are not aware of it. However, as we began our time together today, I led us in a guided time, a guided meditation, where you deliberately and intentionally, or I deliberately and intentionally led you into an awareness of the air. I guided you in intentionally to become aware of the air flowing in and out of your body. You became aware that the air was present and that you were breathing. You became aware of your breathing rhythm. So this is what meditation is. The divine is always present. Meditation is tuning in, a little bit like radio waves. So right at this moment, I'm going to stop speaking for a minute. Right at this moment, you are surrounded by radio waves. Can you hear the music? No, of course you can't. You can't just hear the radio waves with your naked ear. What you need is some kind of transistor or receiver to tune into the radio waves that are there. They're already there, all on different frequencies, or the music is already there, it's already being broadcast. You just can't hear it without that receiver, without that radio set with the area on it, tuning in. That's a bit like meditation. That's a bit like what we did just now when you were focusing on the air and your breath and your breathing. All these things are always there. We're just generally not aware of them. And so the practice of meditation enables us to become aware of that divine presence. You might find it easiest to start on becoming aware or being aware that the divine is present. Just kind of deliberately, cognitively going, I know God is here. I know God is here right now because God is everywhere. But what we want to do through the practice of contemplation and meditation is have that mystic experience. And what that mystical experience is the transition between knowing that God is present and experiencing God's presence. We know cognitively God is there, but we want to transform that from the omnipresence to an intimate presence. We want to transform that from, as McColman says in the big book Christian Mysticism, the present moment to the moment of presence, where we become aware of that divine presence. And it is that awareness of the divine presence, the experience of the divine presence, that is mysticism. Mysticism is an experiential, living out process of the divine presence. Everybody is a mystic, or everybody has the potential to be a mystic. In the dictionary, if you go to the dictionary and have a look at the definition, it's something like someone who uses the contemplative practice to become of one mind and will with their God, with their deity. And so, in essence, really, if that's what mysticism is, then it should just be the path of every Christian, to become of one mind and will with God. That's how it works. That's what Christianity is about, is it not? That's what being Christian means, becoming more like Christ. Christian means Christ-like. It's a Greek word. It means like Christ. And so we become more like Christ. So that's what mysticism is. By using the contemplative practices, by using meditation and those sorts of things, we become more like God. This is the process that the mystics of the past call theosis, or unification with God. And I would suggest that meditation and the mystical life of meditation is a balance between theosis and kenosis. Great Greek words that happen to balance out each other and go together well. Theosis and kenosis. So theosis is becoming one with God. So it is finding that unity with the divine presence, becoming one with God, knowing God, feeling God, being aware of the will of God, the love of God, the presence of God, in an ontological way, not just in your practices, but actually in a continual way. But if that's going to come in, if theosis is going to be part of who we are transformed into, then kenosis also has to happen. Kenosis is a Greek word that means to become empty, to remove from, to empty ourselves. So meditation, a mystical element of meditation, is this balance between theosis and kenosis. God comes in, we empty, or we empty so that God can come in. So that we empty ourselves so that God can step in. Because God can't come in if we are full of ourselves. And I'm sure we all know plenty of Christians who are full of themselves. That's where we need to be a conscious, we need to have a conscious awareness that we need to practice kenosis. We need to empty ourselves. One of the meditation practices I sometimes use, where we were using today, we're using those words, I am here, you are here, we are here together. One of the other terms I often use is the words from John 3 verse 30. I often use that as a mantra, both for myself and when I'm doing guided meditations. In John 3 verse 30, the context of that is John the Baptist is being approached by his disciples because Jesus and Jesus' disciples are down the river doing baptisms. And John the Baptist's disciples come to him and say, are you not bothered that Jesus is down the river and his disciples with him doing baptisms? This is your job. You're supposed to be doing this. And John the Baptist's response, which is what John 3 verse 30 says, is, he must become greater, I must become less. Or some translations of the Bible say, he must increase, I must decrease. And that's a wonderful little mantra to have. Yeah, and it goes with this theosis and kenosis balance as well. That God or Christ in me must increase. That divine presence in me, the awareness of that, the working of the divine presence in me must increase. And the I, the egocentric, arrogant I that blocks me from that divine presence must decrease. He must become greater, I must become less, or he must increase, I must decrease. theosis, kenosis. That's the balance of the meditation practice, the contemplative practice. And it is a continual work within our lives, the theosis and kenosis balance. But it is when it drops from a cognitive awareness and a deliberate practice to being who we are, that it transforms from being just a meditation practice to us being a contemplative, or from being contemplative practices to us being a contemplative. And it is us being a contemplative that really opens the door to mysticism and the role of mysticism in meditation. Because the role of mysticism, and I'm going to pause here to enable us to break off into groups and discuss this for a little while. The role of mysticism in meditation is to draw us more deeply into that divine presence, the experiential divine presence that's transformative for our life, to make us something different, to make us more like God. I'm going to pause. I'm going to break off into breakout groups. I'll just pause the recording. Excellent discussions on meditation and contemplation and mysticism, the difference between the three, and the links in between them. One particular thing that we were just talking about, that sense of the different stages, the meditation being the cognitive deliberate practice, is really important to get hold of, so that we know that we have to do those things. We need to be in that sense of physically or cognitively releasing ourselves and letting go of ourselves to become more aware of that contemplative life that we're living. And that's that sense of releasing the ego, or letting go of the ego. That is the practice of letting go, what some of the mystics call detachment. That is the releasing of our sense of desire for control of ourselves, and the things that happen within our lives, and just simply getting into perhaps that divine flow. Perhaps we can call it that. Thomas Merton used the phrase towards the end of his book, New Seeds of Contemplation, that the contemplative's life is a prolonged immersion in the rivers of tranquility, which flow out from God, out into the whole universe, and draw all things back to God. That sense of just getting into the flow, a prolonged immersion in rivers of tranquility that just flow backwards and forwards in that divine flow. And so we need to let go of ourselves. We need to let go of that sense of our own sense of egocentric self, the need to have control, to be in control of things ourselves, to be in control of our own kind of journey, our own environment, our own self, internal environment, I mean, and just allowing the divine presence to transform us. So we have those kind of stages where we practice the meditation, which is the stilling of ourselves, the centering of ourselves, the being content with the fully present in the moment, as we did in the beginning meditation. And then that leads us into a more contemplative life. So the practice of meditation leads us into the ontology of contemplative life, who we are as a being. Because the more we practice being still and being calm and being centered and drawing into that sense of the presence of the divine and allowing the divine to move in us, the more often we do that, the more that's who we become. So our practice becomes habits, and our habits become who we are. And so we live that contemplative life, and then that moves us into that sense of the theosis and the mysticism, that sense of being one with God. And so this idea of the letting go, or kenosis as I called it, so we looked at, the part of the discussions was looking at the balance between theosis and kenosis, and how one is balanced with the other. So we're letting go of our own self, our sense of self, the kenosis. We are emptying the idea of our own egocentric self. We're letting go of that. We are emptying that from ourselves, enabling space for that divine presence to then settle into us. And then we live in that sense of that presence. We are transformed into that sense of that presence. And that's where we live, the theosis, the sense of becoming one with God, taking on the divine character, as scriptures say. That's the sense of the role of mysticism in meditation. So meditation itself is significant and important because that's where it all begins. We can't get fit physically or spiritually without the intentional getting up and doing something about it. And so like physical fitness, we need to get up and do exercise. And through that exercise, our body becomes fit. We become a fit person. And so through the practice of meditation, we are able to become contemplatives. And actually, the more we practice that, the more we practice the being still and letting go, the more we are able to absorb in that sense, that divine presence, the more we are able to become aware of that divine presence in a higher consciousness state, in a kind of a Christ consciousness, or the mind of Christ, as the Apostle Paul puts it. Have the mind of Christ, that Christ consciousness. That's actually what we're called to do in our own spiritual journey. So we let go of ourselves and the ego through the practice. We become still. We create an environment where we are able to invite or to be able to be hospitable to that divine presence. We create that space within ourselves. We become aware of the presence that is always present. And then we live in a sense of that awareness as well. And we become one with God. We have that sense of the mystical context of our spiritual life. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining in. It was great to have you.